What if our ancient ancestors used their senses in very different ways? And what if places like Stonehenge weren't just built to be seen, but to be heard and experienced through sound? And how through studying this, we could discover the lost science of sound. I talk with Greg Moffitt, the host of LegaliseFreedom.com, to dig into archaeoacoustics, from stone circles designed to bend sound to cathedrals built like instruments. We also get into catastrophism, the theory that a lost civilization, maybe Atlantis itself, was wiped out by some ancient global disaster, and whether we're still carrying the trauma of it. Hello and welcome to the Joe Questions podcast. Today I'm joined by Greg Moffitt, who is a UK writer, editor and broadcaster, and is the host of a long-running podcast called Legalise Freedom. He's spent years interviewing alternative thinkers, researchers on everything from consciousness, the occult, and civilizational decline. If you get a chance to listen to his podcast, you won't be short of fascinating ideas and topics to dive into. So, Greg, how are you today?
Very well, Joe, and thank you so much for inviting me to come on.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to listen to your podcast over the last few weeks. I've been doing my research and I've tried to stick to the original premise, which was archaeoacoustics, but you've got so many different topics that I'd wanted to listen to that I've ranged from Satanism to everything. Basically, you've touched on so many. You've got over 400 podcasts?
Yeah, over 450 now. It would have been a lot more if I'd managed to stick to my original output rate as a podcaster yourself. That's one of the main issues, is constant output, as it were. So originally I was doing one a week, but as the years went by, life gets in the way. But yeah, I've done over 450 in about 13 years, but a lot of other content aside from that. I do blogging as well, movie and TV reviews and whatnot. So yeah, but you'll find this as you go along. You'll start out with I'm going to do this many podcasts in this space of time, and then life will get in the way. But that's okay.
And so the reason I reached out to you is because you were talking at the Glastonbury Symposium. I've spoken with Andy Thomas, and I'm from the county of Wiltshire, which is famous for places like Avebury and Stonehenge. And I wanted to know more about Stonehenge, Avebury, what they're for. And I came across this idea of archaeoacoustics, which I hadn't really heard of before. So for other people like myself who aren't familiar with it, what is it? And if you could delve into that region for me.
Yeah, so if you break it down, archaeo as in archaeology and acoustics as in, study of sound or the nature of sound. So it's really just how our ancestors, the people who came before us, particularly ancient ancestors, related with sound and to the sound world, whether it was sound they generated, sound they heard, just the whole sound world really in the distant past. And it's the archaeology of sound, as it were. It's looking for signs and evidence to see how ancient humans related to the sound, the natural world in terms of sound, and how they used sound and understood sound. Their understanding very different to how ours is today. So that's kind of that in a nutshell.
So I've heard many different theories as to Stonehenge's purpose. People think it's to mark the passing of celestial bodies, the sun, the moon. People think that it can reflect light. There's talk about ley lines. You've done podcasts about that giants related to Stonehenge. There's so many different theories. How do you go about, as a researcher in these kind of topics, how do you go about picking which one you think is most likely to reflect the truth?
Well, the one thing to say here is regarding megalithic sites, specifically stone circles in this case, no one knows what they were for. it's simply an inference based on their, their construction, how they appear to have been made, and other theories about, human activity, how societies in the past differed from our own. And I think there's elements that line up that seem to make sense in terms of like as above, so below. So some of these sites were to do, related to the observation of the stars, movement of heavenly bodies, in terms of like, a calendar for the year with practical applications, and in terms of farming or crops, for example, but also maybe predicting the weather. But then there's also this mystical, sort of religious dimension to it as well. But nobody really knows what these sites were for. Anybody who claims to know categorically is not being completely honest. But from my point of view, one of the things that interested me most as someone who studied music technology and was a music journalist for many decades and a professional musician for a while as well, was the sound dimension of it, which clearly I think is a neglected aspect of these sites. And certainly at Stonehenge, for example, as I spoke about at Glastonbury Symposium, some of these stones, the inner surface of that is, the side facing into the circle are concave, which would have interesting reflective sound properties. And my contention is that sound was a very important dimension of these sites. And again, this is not unique by any means. I've simply picked up on the work of, for example, a researcher like Paul Devereaux, who you can find in my interviews with at legalise-freedom.com, and you can then link from there, to his own work. So this is not a new thing at all. It's simply something that, pardon the pun, resonated with me as someone fascinated by sound and by music.
Yeah, I was actually listening to a song this week by Earth, Wind and Fire called In the Stone. And if you haven't heard it, I recommend you listen to it, because it basically talks about how something is written in the stone. Do you think stones actually hold technology within them? Do you think there's something encoded within stones that we can get through acoustics? Is it healing properties or anything like that?
Potentially, yes. There's a couple of things you're touching on here. I mean, there's certainly electromagnetic qualities to stone, and particularly in quartz crystal, for example, present in in granite and whatnot. But you're also touching upon something known as stone tape theory, which is the idea that that certain types of stone can absorb and store energy from events, physical events in the outside world, and that these can be accessed, kind of like a memory, if you see what I mean. So the term comes from a television, one-off television drama that you might have heard of, listeners or viewers might have heard, called Stone Tape. Certainly, you can find information about that readily online. So it's this idea about, and this is where the idea of ghosts come from as well. The idea that emotionally or energetically charged events in the world, the three-dimensional, five-sense world that you and I and the viewers are occupying at the minute, can leave an imprint on, the more inert material world, is stone being a good example. And if you look into the nature of crystals, for example, in this area, it starts to get very, very interesting as well. And obviously, there's an overlap there between crystals and between stone. So that's a roundabout way, I think, of trying to answer your point.
Yeah. So I listened to a podcast you did recently with Maria Wheatley, and she talked about the elongated skulls that were found at Avebury. And there was also discussion how their eardrums were differently. So do you think early humans they used senses differently to what we would use now? Do you think it's almost like an atrophy of this sense because of the world we live in?
I do think so. I think that in my talk at Glastonbury recently, I did refer to a book published in the early 80s by Julian Jaynes, now no longer with us. And his book's entitled The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And the central contention there is that in his timeline, it's up to about 2000 BC, something like that, that humans weren't conscious in the same way that we are. I don't mean that as a derogatory comment, but simply they had a different type of consciousness, and that they didn't have thoughts in the way that you and I might think of it, but rather they heard voices in their head, auditory hallucinations, which they took as instructions in what to do and how to live, and how to be in the world, as it were. So I think that necessarily affected their senses, and they had a more holistic view of the world. As I say, there wasn't a world of boundaries that we have. You and I and the viewers think of themselves as a self-contained unit, and that everything's happening inside here. Whereas in the past, we know there was a more holistic view of the natural world, and humans saw themselves as as complete part of that. There was no separation, shall we say, no compartmentalization. So I think in terms of what humans apprehended with their five senses, it was seen as a seamless whole, really. So as for physical, biological differences in, apparatus, for example, like the hearing, I'm not sure about that. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of physical evolution of humans in any timeline that we know of. It seems to have been a long time since humans were physically any different. I think you'd have to go back hundreds of thousands of years, possibly millions of years for that. And so I think where we have been for certainly all of human history that we can say anything about, and certainly now that human evolution is on the mental and spiritual level, not on the physical.
Yeah, and I think about the cathedrals that you've referenced in some of your talks before, and I like the quote. I can't remember exactly. If you can, I think that'd be great for listeners to hear. But the idea that architecture is, I can't remember which way it is round, but something is liquid music.
Yeah, frozen.
Yeah, frozen. Yeah, I love that quote. Because I believe you have worked in a cathedral, and having been to cathedrals like Durham Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral, you can't help but feel that they are made to incorporate sound. And that description of frozen music is really apt for them. Do you think that civilization that built those Gothic cathedrals was I use the word seeing, was living life through the prism of sound?
There's certainly a very important dimension, just on a practical level. If you go into one of these spaces, let's say the Gothic cathedrals, I mean, there's earlier ones. For example, Durham is a Norman cathedral, so it predates the Gothic period, but we're only talking about splitting hairs in terms of architectural styles. Sound was just as important. So yes, sound has always been important to humans. So on a practical level in the cathedral, the priest needs to be heard, and those are very resonant spaces. And even you go into one of those Gothic cathedrals now, anybody with a reasonably strong voice who can project it can stand at the altar and be heard, 100 meters back by congregants, if you see what I mean. So they're designed to be an era before electrical amplification. There was natural amplification, which I've talked a lot about in my talk on archaeoacoustics. So I think sound was a big part of it, and this is partly why, having worked in some of these places, partly why electrical, music and sound in the electrical world that we have now does quite poorly in these spaces, because they're not designed for electrical amplification, as it were. I've seen rock bands play in cathedrals and cathedral-like spaces and sound pretty poor, actually, because it's not designed for that, as it were. So yeah, they were designed to overwhelm the senses, really, and sound is certainly part of that. You're talking about a pre-literate age. Now, obviously, there's been literacy has come and gone throughout human history, but certainly when you're in the Middle Ages, or the Norman period, say in the Middle Ages in Britain, very few people could read and write. So they would come to buildings like cathedrals by far the biggest thing they'd ever seen probably in their lives. And there'd be the stained glass and there'd be the stonework, and it would all just be so overwhelming and awesome. And, and sound was part of that.
How did they even make these cathedrals back then? Because
well,
the size and the scale of them without the machinery they have is.
Yeah, well, there are much bigger buildings now. Obviously, because one thing that we can talk about previous construction feats like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the pyramids in Giza, in Egypt, but also there's pyramids all around the world. And then talk about Stonehenge and, the megalithic builders. We can go on all day about how that was done. We don't know. But certainly in the Middle Ages and the construction of the Gothic cathedrals, we know very little about how it was actually done. But, that's relatively modern compared to the sorts of time periods I was talking about at Glastonbury. And they had all the hand tools that we have now. In terms of, hammer, chisels, things to carve stone, but it was all done by hand. They had machines, maybe a bit of horsepower, pulleys and whatnot. But it's an incredible feat. If you go to any of these buildings and look at them and, look at the different blocks of stone that make them up, and, some of the biggest cathedrals, in Britain and anywhere else in the world, but, we're both in Britain, that's what we're talking about. They've got millions of blocks of stone. I mean, the cathedral in my home city here took 252 years to build. By hand, so there's so many details lost in terms of their construction. But they've been reverse engineered for centuries as well by people maintaining them. And as technology's moved on, we've been able to say, oh, God, this is probably how they did this and probably how they did this, but this is how we can do it now. But it doesn't take away from the amazing achievement of constructing something like that with very little that we'd have at our disposal today. Certainly no energy, no power tools, nothing electrical. It's quite incredible. And there would have been hundreds of people at any given time working on the construction of one of these buildings. And I'm not sure we could do it today in terms of manpower or, person power, because there wouldn't be enough people with the skills.
Yeah, well, we can't build HS2 or any train tracks, let alone cathedrals of that scale. So I highly doubt we could do something like that. When I think of sound and I think of its application more recently, I don't know if you're aware, but when the US kidnapped the leader of Venezuela, supposedly they used a type of sound wave weapon. Have you heard of that?
I'm aware of that event, but no, I wasn't aware that they did that. That's quite interesting, actually. I'd like to know more about that. Certainly, sound weapons do exist. At the very simple level, they have crowd control devices, which some police and paramilitary, not paramilitary, but military police forces around the world have, and these can be mounted on vehicles, and you can take them into a crowd control situation and broadcast frequencies that are very disrupting to human auditory system, painful and debilitating, a bit like pepper spray for the ears, really.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose in ancient times, the walls of Jericho were also brought down with sound as well. So perhaps they had a form of technology that utilized sound that we've lost.
Yeah, this is a general area. I didn't mention the walls of Jericho in my Glastonbury talk, but it is something I do mention. I mentioned acoustic levitation in the talk as a way of moving blocks of stone, because one of the ongoing mysteries about megalith builders or the pyramids or any of the ancient sites we've mentioned is how the hell did they actually move these enormous blocks of stone? Some of them maybe like 100 tons. And today, to move something like that, of that size, there is some moving, lifting equipment that exists in the world, but very few bits of machinery. You might have to go to China or Siberia or something and say, can you get that truck, with 100-foot high wheels or something? Can you bring that halfway across the world so we can move this bit of stone? So how it was done, apparently, without any of that sort of machinery is an eternal mystery. So yeah, the Jericho thing would be a good thing to introduce into that milieu, actually, that I'm talking about. But yeah, so I just think that sound had a role in all of this. that is not, how can I put it, not understood at all. I think it's something that, like many things in the ancient past, was kind of taken for granted at one point, but then whether it was the Dark Ages or some other point, maybe going from pre-Ice Age through the trauma of the Ice Age and out the other side, that knowledge and understanding in human affairs became lost. Simple example, if you look at the pottery being made in Dark Age Britain compared to the pottery being made in Roman Britain, it's very simplistic and undecorated. So something was lost, if you know what I mean. Knowledge was lost. And that's happened again and again and again. And certainly I think that we could see that happening in the future, in terms of like the knowledge infrastructure, like the internet that you and I and everyone else takes for granted. If that ever goes away, who knows what we'll be able to salvage from that in the future. But human history is not in a straight line. It's cyclical, I believe. It's not from primitive to futuristic. I think it goes round, like an Ouroboros eating its own tail. And I'm just about to start a new podcast series actually called What Happens When the Internet Goes Down. And this builds on an interview I did with a regular guest called Mark Stavish, which was all based around a novel called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is all about how over centuries and millennia of time and multiple civilizational collapses, multiple apocalypses, and multiple stone ages and space ages, how, in the case of this book, how religious knowledge became preserved, but also changed over time. So I think we're part of that cycle as well. Just at the minute, the cycle of human civilization is very much Star Trek. We're going to the moon, we're going to have holidays on the moon, and we're going to colonize Mars. I think the shine is coming off that a little bit, in the early part of the 21st century. But certainly that's been the trend. I'm not sure how old you are, clearly a lot younger than me, but in my lifetime, that was very much the trajectory. But I think that's going away. And if not in my lifetime, maybe in yours, or maybe in your children's lifetime, if you ever have them. You might have them already, I don't know. But they may face a contraction in human civilization and a time when knowledge and skills are lost and maybe never recovered. Because certainly I think there seems to be something in the ancient past that we can look at. You said yourself, how did they do it? Something that we haven't recovered and maybe never will.
Yeah, one thing that always stands out to me is when people say that Cleopatra is closer to the iPhone than she was to the pyramids. And I'm sure if you ask Cleopatra, she couldn't know the exact truth as to why the pyramids were there. So although she existed in what most people would say is the same civilization, she doesn't really. She's just in the corpse of a previous civilization. And it could easily be that future generations live around the buildings that we've built, but they don't really know the context of how they're built. And like you said, post-internet, with people not collecting books and with AI companies destroying books after they scan them, if the internet did go down, we would lose all that knowledge. And I certainly couldn't rebuild a MacBook or a camera and start podcasting again post-internet, because this is the accumulation of knowledge generation after generation that's got us here. And it wouldn't take much for us to sort of break that chain and to start again. I've actually got a question about the pyramids, because we talked about ancient Egypt. There have been those scans recently where they've hypothesized that underneath the pyramids, there's these long columns that go into the ground. And some people suggest that they actually they work with the vibration of the earth in order to send that energy up and use that as a transducer to convert that seismic energy into electromagnetism or sound. And there's certain frequencies work with the granite in order to create this electromagnetic energy, which is, I think Christopher Dunn talks about this, the fact that there's been scans since he wrote that book. Do you think that sort of leans into this idea of sound and vibrations?
Yes. No, I'm aware that what you're talking about, and Christopher Dunn's work and other people as well in a similar sort of area. including Joseph P. Farrell as well, and his work on pyramids. But I don't know the details of it. There was quite recently that story came out, wasn't it? That there's new discovery there. So I did look at it. I had a cursory look at it. I don't know the details, but it does sound very plausible, and it would completely make sense in the context of the pyramids being clearly not just tombs. I don't know what you were taught at school. We were told that Egyptian pyramids were tombs for the pharaohs to be buried in, where if you look at the construction of them, the level of detail, clearly a lot of technical things going on there. If they were tombs, that was only part of their purpose. So what you're referring to, which again, viewers, I keep saying listeners because I mostly do audio myself, viewers can easily find out the details of that story if they don't already know it. But it really does make sense. I've got lots of content touching upon similar things, again, at legalise-freedom.com. Viewers can go there, and there's a search box. There's a tag cloud down on the right-hand side for popular topics. And there's also a search box at the top. They can put in, for example, Egypt or pyramids, whatever, and bring up any relevant content that I've done in the past.
Yeah. And I think about the pyramids, we've mentioned before, how would they move stones? They had to move stones from quite far away, which made me think that to do that nowadays, you would need a crane. That in itself would be a huge effort to move the crane. So I think that just dispels that theory, really. And yeah, we were taught that they were tombs. This idea that Khufu's tomb, but I just think it's such a hard thing to defend, the idea that the pyramids were built just to be tombs, and then there's no hieroglyphics or mention, and the only reference to Khufu inside the Great Pyramid is a piece of graffiti in a chamber that was discovered, and then the cartouche was done the wrong way round. It was discovered by Howard Weiss, and even there's a book by I think it was the Prince of Prussia at the time, saying that he thought Howard Weiss was doing fraud at the time. So I don't think they're tombs, but I do think there is something to do with harnessing the Earth's frequencies, and I think just look at the construction materials, the granite, that would make sense. Definitely interesting. So tell me a little bit more about archaeoacoustics and what you spoke about in your talk about Glastonbury, the Glastonbury Symposium, and how has it evolved in the last few years?
Well, I did present the talk a couple of years ago at the Mysterious Earth Conference in St Anne's on Sea, which is near Blackpool. But the nub of it is that it's just the difference between the ancient sound world and the one that we live in, how that's changed, and not really for the better. And it's how our ancient ancestors heard the world differently, how they engaged with sound differently, and how the world was much, much quieter. And we basically live in a sort of a sonic soup these days with 24/7, depending on where you are in the world, but 24/7 kind of cacophony and artificial. When I say artificial sound, obviously I don't mean like the wind and the waves and the bird song, natural, but just everything that's televisions and devices and music in elevators and music in supermarkets and traffic, and it's just non-stop. And I think a lot of us are not even aware of it anymore. So it blocks out a hell of a lot of what our ancestors would have taken for granted, a much more subtle sound environment. The Glastonbury talk will be in the not too distant future available for people to stream or download at the Glastonbury Symposium website. It's not ready just yet, but I'll be letting my own subscribers know via my mailing lists when that becomes available. So if any of your viewers are interested in checking that out, again, just keep an eye on legalise-freedom.com or my YouTube or Substack, and say in the near future I'll put up a notice about that.
Yeah, I live in London, so I'm hearing the tube and all the noises all the time. And I think what I would equate it to is a bit like light pollution and how people can't see the stars nowadays. And I think auditorily it's a similar thing where we can't hear nature. I mean, I sat recently in a small conservation area next to the tube line, And I sat there and I couldn't believe I could hear birds. I was just hearing different types of birds, and it sounded like they were talking to each other. And that is kind of a rare experience when you live in cities like London, to actually just get to enjoy the different sound of birds, how different they sound, the fact that it does sound like conversation. And it's the same when you get off the tube. You look up at the sky and you see very few stars. You might see some of the big ones on a crisp, cold winter's night. But we are kind of detached from nature. And also that will mean we're detached from the type of world that the ancients who built the likes of Stonehenge, the pyramids, would have lived in at that time.
Yeah, we're absolutely very detached. That was a nice experience that you had. But you're right, most people are not even aware of what the night sky really looks like, because, if you're in London, you live anywhere near central London, if you want to walk out of London, you could spend half a day before you even get to the M25, So, and a lot of people live most of their lives in urban environments, and increasingly people are being moved into urban environments for different reasons. They go there because it's a magnet for, work opportunities or whatever it happens to be. There's just stuff there, infrastructure. But also people are increasingly being moved out of the country. There's more and more, greening sort of measures that mean rural lifestyles are more and more untenable. Farming, for example, or even just finding a job in the rural environment. So and it's not even as intense in Britain as it is, for example, in somewhere like India or China, or if you go to some of the mega cities there, it's just off scale. I mean, what's the population of London? Last time I looked, it was 6 million. Maybe it's more than that now. That's about the total population of Ireland, where I'm from.
Yeah.
In terms of, by the way, if you don't mind, a couple of things I thought of earlier that I just wanted to throw in before I forget. You were talking about lost knowledge and about recovering the ability to do things in future. If people are at legalisefreedom.com, there's an interview with a chap called Lewis Dartnell from a few years ago. That's Dartnell, about his book called The Knowledge. And that was very much about, what we would need to preserve for future generations if they were to be able to try and piece together civilization again in anything like the shape we have it. So Lewis Dartnell, his book The Knowledge, and also something called the Toaster Project. And this was a guy, I can't remember his name, but he published a book on this. And what he tried to do was build a toaster from scratch. And you're probably thinking, well, how difficult can it be? With a bit of, soldering iron and a few bits of metal and plastic. No, he thought, how do you make a toaster from scratch? That included mining the ore to smelt to make the metal in the toaster, making the plastic from oil. And you can see on the cover of the book is the toaster that he made, and it's a piece of shit. It barely functions. But the Toaster Project was an indication of just how much trouble we could be in if we had any kind of massive societal disruption or collapse. It could literally be, a post-apocalyptic Mad Max type scenario where we just completely just have to use what is left in the aftermath, and when that's gone, it's gone.
Yeah, I had a thought earlier. I listened to an Elon Musk interview and he spoke about how we're going to live in an age of abundance. So I thought, what would that mean if everybody had a car? And that might sound great, but what if you live in Congo where all the lithium and cobalt for the batteries of the car goes? It might sound like it's an abundance if everybody gets a car, but what if you live at the place where they need the materials to build those cars? Then you're going to get kicked out. So everyone else's abundance is going to be at your expense. And I think that's the reality is you need lots of raw materials to build lots of stuff that we take for granted. And we certainly aren't using our brains more nowadays with AI to solve problems. So, if we were subject to the kind of meteor impact that I think Graham Hancock talks about, it would be bad times. And I also think if we were hit by a comet, that would lead the Earth to vibrate for quite a long time, which I think is mentioned in some historical texts. The idea that the Earth itself was vibrating for a long time, which I imagine would have had some sort of traumatic impact on any of the humans that were around to sort of survive that period and restart civilization. Do you think that's what happened then? Do you think 12,000 years ago, the Earth went through something quite traumatic and we've had to restart again?
Well, I'm not an original thinker in this area, but it does seem to be that way. Certainly Graham Hancock, who you just mentioned, presents a lot of compelling evidence, some of it circumstantial, but certainly something to think about. This was also a central plank of my Glastonbury talk, which is this idea of catastrophism, that something terrible happened in human history to our species more than once, that brought us to almost to the brink of extinction. There's a theory about, or some evidence for a massive volcanic eruption in what's now India in the distant past, that reduced the total population of the Earth to as little as 5,000. And that has genetic implications as well. If you've got 5,000 people in one small area of the world who are all genetically self-similar, that certainly impacts, the future, biology of humans. But yeah, so Graham Hancock, I mentioned in my talk, also Immanuel Velikovsky, he's kind of the father of this idea. I think he coined the term catastrophism. And also, I mentioned the American author Michael Cremo, who doesn't really talk about catastrophism, but or about disasters, impacting humanity in the past. But he does talk about the human timeline being much, much longer than is generally accepted or even willing to be imagined. Possibly that humans have been on the Earth for millions of years, and this opens up a lot of space for lots of different things, to have happened to humans in the past, and for us to have gone through all of these different civilizational cycles that I mentioned earlier, about, a rise, technological society that then destroys itself. And this is where the myth of Atlantis comes from. It's a technologically advanced civilization that destroys itself with its own advanced technology. Whether you believe in anything specifically like that, certainly the myths and legends that come down to us, I'd also include in this, the flood legends, the universal deluge myth that the Bible story of Noah is part of. They're everywhere across the world. So I think that these terrible kind of great reset things have happened to humans in the past, but we don't really like to think about it, because if we accept that as potential history, that means it also can be a potential future, and that something similar could happen again. When I did a post recently on Substack talking about the recent solar eclipse, and one of the things that came out of me experiencing that was a reflection on how this is still a big part of human consciousness, the idea that some kind of external force, some kind of agency outside of our own control could profoundly affect our very existence. And I talk about a couple of films and that, because I do a movie and TV review series called Hauntology and Dystopia, which you can find again online. And I mentioned the films Melancholia, which is about a rogue planet and colliding with the Earth and ending all life forever, and also about the movie Sunshine, which is about the sun dying, going cold, and ending all life on Earth as a result of that. So these themes resonate again and again and again, and I think there's a reason for that. These are not just interesting science fiction stories. I think that we all know, and this again maybe ties in with your point earlier about the significance of Stonehenge and these other sites as maybe relating to being observatories for actions in the heavens, that our ancient ancestors inherently knew that as above so below, that what happens up there affects what happens down here, and it's something that we're just not really in tune with in our modern science and materialism. We kind of deny that. And this is actually where astrology comes from. At a time, astrology and astronomy were really just one and the same things. And the idea that the heavenly bodies affect human affairs is encapsulated really just in the effect of the moon on the Earth. As you know, it affects the tides, women's menstrual cycles, etc. So I think it's just something that we're in denial about. And this is why there's so much fevered speculation, isn't there? When there is some kind of a comet or a meteor or something passing by Earth, every few years you get a headline just saying, oh, such and such will pass within however many miles of Earth. And People are kind of, nervously kind of giggling about this, just thinking, imagine if it hit the planet. Because we can accept this idea, for example, in the case of the dinosaurs, because even though they were already in decline in terms of population, when that impact happened, people would say, yeah, we can accept that. Yeah, the dinosaurs were finished off by that planetary impact. But the idea that could happen to us, oh, no, clearly we're past that. We're not. And our technology won't be able to do anything to ward that off. What's the film with Bruce Willis in it? Is it Armageddon? You might have seen it, but there's one anyway where there's something heading for the Earth and they fly off and there's a heroic mission to try and prevent it. But again, these things don't just come out of nowhere. There's a kind of a buried species consciousness about our vulnerability to events off planets, or movements off planet, other things in the solar system and in the galaxy.
Where do you think Atlantis was, based on all the different theories? Have you got an idea of where you think it might be, or
No,
have I got that wrong? Maybe it wasn't a single place.
Yeah. Okay. So I think Atlantis is kind of an idea, if you know what I mean, for a civilization that existed, or one or more actually, in the very distant past, pre-Ice Age. Could have been just before the Ice Age. Could have been, who knows? If you take Michael Cremo's idea about millions of years of human existence on Earth, there could have been multiple civilizations like that. But geographically, I don't think it really matters. There's a few different theories, each of which presents its own case. There's one, again, where it's just south of India, where there's a lot of ruins, a few hundred feet underwater. There's in the center of the Atlantic. There's also, if you look at my, again, legalise-freedom.com, I have an interview with the author Graham Phillips, and he cites Atlantis somewhere else. So again, just put Atlantis in the search box, you come up with a few different options and possibilities there. Personally, I'm not really invested in it. I don't think it matters. I think it's highly likely that there was some kind of, advanced is a kind of loaded word, but there was some kind of civilization prior to the Ice Age, even just statistically, basing it on that, that was what we would recognize as more advanced than some of the civilizations that came afterwards, in the same way that you've referred to, that, the ancient Egyptians and, other civilizations like that did things that we would struggle to do now. We certainly do things that they would find unimaginable, all our electronics and, the internet and all of that stuff. But that's just what we're doing now, and it's something that in the future other civilizations may not be able to do. But as for Atlantis, if it was one thing, where it actually was, I've got no idea.
So I personally think, if I had to pick my top candidate, it would actually be where the Richat structure is in Mauritania. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Mauritania, there's these concentric rings in the middle of the Sahara Desert. But if you actually look at Google Maps and you zoom out, it almost looks like a cloth has swept over the Sahara Desert, almost as far as Egypt. And it looks that you could even see the direction of where water may have traveled. So if there was a comet that hit the North American ice sheet, and then the water, almost like a tsunami, swept over that part of Africa and then came out and swept stuff away, I think it could be feasible that it could have been in where it is modern-day Mauritania. Another reason I think that, and this is just stuff I've had in my head, is one of the renowned richest men of all time was Mansa Musa, who came from the Mali area, which is next to Mauritania, and he's famous for having so much gold. And I believe Atlantis was also a place that had lots of gold. So it may well be that this civilization, which was famed for its gold, was in this abundant area for gold, Ivory Coast, the gold region, Mali, all that sort of stuff. And maybe the gold he discovered was remnants of that previous civilization, unless that got completely washed away when the water entered back into the Atlantic. I've also heard other theories that it could have been southern Spain, sort of islands around there, the Azores. I think the area you're mentioning is like the Sunderland, which is in Indonesia, maybe,
Mm.
was one of the theories in Ancient Apocalypse. I know Graham Hancock also then thought that America itself may have been Atlantis because it was described as almost like a turtle type shape. So there's lots of different theories. I really like the reshape structure one just because there's this random unexplained concentric circles in the middle of the Sahara Desert, which fits the description of Atlantis in some descriptions. But yeah, that's just something I thought I'd share with you.
Yeah, if you do a Google search for Atlantis, an image search, one of the things that comes up again and again is a sort of an island city with a series of concentric circles, as part of the design, as a key part of the design. Two things you can check out on my website is my interview with Robert Schoch from many, many years ago. And his work, I mentioned this in relation to your thinking about the sighting of Atlantis. His work on the dating, he's a geologist, his working on the dating of the Sphinx and how
Yeah.
there's water erosion evident on the Sphinx, which means that there must have been, as a result of heavy rain. So, of course, that part of
Yeah.
Africa would have been green. It was like a desert relatively recently. And there's even images going back just a couple of centuries, paintings or drawings of the pyramids surrounded by water. The idea that this was in someone's memory, as it were.
Yeah.
So there's that idea, obviously, that the environment there was very different at the time. You wouldn't build a great city in the middle of a desert. But it wasn't always like that. The desertification of that region has been an ongoing thing,
Yeah.
again, and relatively recent. The other thing, a bit of a tangent, but in terms of gold, a recent interview with a monetary expert, economics writer and comedian, Dominic Frisby, The Secret History of Gold. If anybody's interested at all in the role of gold in human civilization, check that out. It's fascinating.
Definitely. And some people think that even the erosion on the very top of the second pyramid, which still has a bit of a cap, that the shape of the erosion suggests almost like a back and forth tidal motion. So it could be that the water was that high that it almost engulfed the entire pyramid. And then what we're actually left with is almost like a clue in the cap of the pyramid. Obviously, this is just a theory, but it is quite compelling and quite visual when you think about the fact that the water could have swept that high. And yeah, I suppose gold has always been critical to humans. And for some people who believe that the Anunnaki, I don't know if you veer into these directions, but I've heard the Anunnaki created humans, or they created a species, whether that be human or not, in order to mine gold. So I think gold has some properties that make it very useful. And I think that usefulness would be universal, whatever star system you come from. But yeah, all very interesting. So you said you're working on an upcoming series. When will that be coming out?
Well, yeah, the one I mentioned referring to is what happens when the internet goes down. That's just when I get round to it. I've already contacted a few people about it, potential guests, and it's just something that I wanted to zero in on because it's just something I see as an increasing threat stroke possibility. And I just wanted to get some key thinkers' ideas on that because it's something that's unimaginable to most people, but it's something we may have to deal with. Now, for most of my life, there was no internet. I was at university when I first got access to the internet as it was then. That was in 1993. And so I could live in a world without the internet. Yes, there would be lots of attendant chaos and mayhem and people running around like headless chickens. But in terms of my day-to-day life, I can cope without the internet because I mostly lived without it. But if that was to happen, like just a little, I'm talking about, I know the idea is that it's not one entire, complete thing. It's kind of like subdivided, and it's meant to be able to, bits of it are meant to be able to survive when other bits go down. Nevertheless, if suddenly the lights just went off in terms of the World Wide Web, what the ensuing hours and days and weeks would look like. It's a bit like imagining, same thing with the electricity grids or telecommunications. You know what I mean? So if there was some kind of electromagnetic pulse,
Yeah.
whether it was man-made or whether it was, again, thinking of catastrophism, whether it was a solar flare or something. This is something, a very, very real possibility. And I think we'd be our own worst enemies if that happened, because we could absolutely survive without it. But whether we would just turn on each other,
Yeah.
that's another matter. I think that's probably what would happen.
I think you mentioned Robert Schoch. I think one of his theories is that there was a solar flare that caused the rapid melting ice, which is different to Graham Hancock, who thinks it was a meteor impact. And then there's other people who think that the poles of the Earth could shift, and that could be another reason. Two questions. What do you think is most likely to cause an apocalypse, and what's your plan?
Well, there's no plan really. I mean, I've got quite a few tins of sardines in the cupboard. They keep me going. I've got about 3 months worth of food. But as for like what would cause civilizational collapse, there's multiple, as we've discussed. We've outlined about half a dozen of them, and there's all sorts of things that could happen. But again, it's not something that's in our collective consciousness really. It's certainly in the collective unconscious, and that's a big part of, let's say, the talk that I gave. This sort of species consciousness that something really bad did happen in the past multiple times and could happen again. But no, I think we're quite ill prepared really for anything, any major kind of societal disruption. I mean, here we are in Britain. You know what happens if we get an unusually cold winter and there's like a bit of snow or something. Suddenly transport systems start to go awry. Railway companies start talking about, the wrong type of leaves on the line or whatever, and they can't run the trains. People can't get to work. People don't know how to drive on ice, so they crash their cars or can't go. The tiniest little things, And we saw during COVID, during that pandemic couple of years when a lot of normal, systems and routines were disrupted, how badly some people dealt with it when really there was no kind of existential threat to society. So you can only imagine what it'd be like if something really big happened. But as for potential causes of that, take your pick. There's plenty. We're not short of those.
Yeah. I think the UK has about 3 days worth of food at any given time. Even with the most recent hot weather and the potential effects on farmers' yields, which could have impact on food shortages, I think the UK is very ill prepared. We live very much for the here and now. And I think a lot of the biggest things we face are man-made issues. So the war in Iran causing an impact on oil supplies. But those we would struggle to deal with, but let alone bigger issues like a solar flare, because that really would be sort of out of our control. So yeah, my plan, if in London, I've always thought if anything kicked off, I would want to be near the tube system so I could get around underground and use the tubes to get around. But I imagine it wouldn't be a very safe or fun place to be in the dark around there. But that could be a potential system. I've got a few ideas of where to be.
No, I mean, recently...
No, you don't like that idea?
Sorry, say again?
You don't like that idea?
No, I really don't. I recently watched a couple of post-apocalyptic films. Many of your viewers will be familiar with the 1984 film Threads, a British-made film about the aftermath of a nuclear war. It's absolutely the most horrific film you'll ever see. But as the threat of war increases, one of the things that everyone's trying to do is get out of the cities. Threads is based in Sheffield, but everyone's just trying to leave the cities. And there's another slower apocalypse movie that I recently watched called No Blade of Grass, which is based on the novel The Death of Grass by John Christopher. And that's an environmental collapse where all grass and grass-based crops fail. That includes wheat and most of the things that humans eat. It's not meat, basically. And again, that's centered in London. Everyone's just trying to get out of the city. So, if you had a plan at all, or if you're concerned about the future, I'd say don't stay in London.
Can you look after a couple of can of sardines for me? keep them fresh, keep them warm.
Well,
I'll come up if I need to.
well, what I can do is, and this is how it'll play out, is I can barter with you. You can have some of my sardines if I can have some of your eggs or a bottle of your whiskey or something. You have to offer me something in return.
Right. I'll bring some whiskey up. So I think we mentioned earlier, you've done over 450 podcasts, which is an incredible feat. Do you have any particular highlights from all of those conversations that you've had?
Oh, to be honest with you, I'm fortunate to have interviewed so many people who I've admired, and read over the years and watched and whatnot. There's still people I'd like to add to the list, but it's very difficult to pick highlights after all this time, because I'd have to go and start combing through the website just to remind myself. But yeah, there's not been anything that I didn't stop, press stop on the record and didn't feel pleased about. So I know that's not really answering your question, but I'll leave it to your viewers to just go and have a bit of an explore. But if they're interested in any or all of the subjects we've touched on, then I'd say there's a a wealth of material there, an archive going back to 2012 that they can spend time exploring. The 10 years worth of that material was completely free. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've been running a subscription model. So more recent podcasts are a sort of half free, half paid thing. So anyone can get the first half gratis and for nothing. And then if they want to get the full experience, there's a small charge for subscription, but it's not expensive at all. So that's how things are. And I've also got Substack, a YouTube channel, Podbean, Apple Music, iTunes, all of the usual platforms, however people normally consume audio and video, they can find me there as well.
Nice. So coming up next, you'll continue with your podcast. You've got a series about what we will do if the internet goes down. Are you working on anything else?
Yeah, it never ends really. So my next interview is on Sunday. That's with the psychologist Steve Taylor. And again, just a bit of a curveball. It's about the magic and the mystery of the Beatles' creativity. That's the Beatles, the famous British pop band. So
Oh, yeah.
he's just published a book about that, and it's very interesting. He brings his experience as a transpersonal psychologist to analyzing the Beatles, and it's a really a different take on, and again, of a great interest to me as a former professional musician and a music journalist, a great interest to me of how creativity functions, in this case, in the world of music. And in a nutshell, it's kind of like the Beatles were kind of a conduit for something beyond themselves, something non-material. I remember Robert Plant and Jimmy Page talking about, from Led Zeppelin, talking about writing Stairway to Heaven. And they said, we didn't really write it, we just channeled it, So that's what this Beatles talk is a great deal about.
I'll definitely be listening to that. And I'm obviously fascinated about their transition to a different image, I think, post LSD ventures, their trips to India. I think there's parallels between them and Steve Jobs as well. I think he also had experiences with LSD and also went to India. I think that was quite formative for him. So yeah, sounds really fascinating. I'm also a lover of music. I do love old music. I've got an old soul, and I think there is something true you said about how things probably got lost when it went from analog to digital. I definitely like my soul music, and I like hearing actual musicians play instruments rather than to just get replaced by computers, essentially. But there is some music where it sort of utilizes both and it still has a powerful effect. And I still go to live music events where it does feel like it gets into your body, and there is something very powerful about congregating together through music, through rhythm, that you share an energy and a thing together. So I think, bringing in music absolutely fits all of this kind of area. So yeah, I'll be definitely tuning in. And I think the Beatles also have a movie coming out, or they're working on making a movie as well soon.
I'm not aware of that, but oddly enough, I'm not really a fan of the Beatles. I'm aware of, obviously, who couldn't be aware, who can be alive on this planet and not be aware of the Beatles. But I've heard a lot of their songs, but not really a fan of the music. But that's not really the point. I recognize them as like possibly the most important, pop band, of all time, certainly the 20th century. But we'll never see their like again. So that's why I'm doing the show with Steve. I've done many other interviews with him, by the way. He was one of my early guests on his book, The Fall, which was about a catastrophic change in human civilization for the worst, which was kind of, the fall comes from the idea of the Garden of Eden, what happened in the wake of that. So again, that ties in with a lot of things we've been talking about, that human progress is not guaranteed, or the only way is up. It's actually up and down and around and around, and golden ages and dark ages. That seems to be the pattern.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed. I think we're heading for the Kali Yuga, which is supposedly a golden age. And I'd like to think that I'm going to live in a golden age. So hopefully the internet stays up. And luckily it stayed up long enough to have a great conversation. I've really appreciated your time, Greg. I really enjoy your podcast. So it's been an absolute honor to have you on. And I definitely direct everyone who's watching or listening to go to Greg's content at Legalise Freedom. Fascinating stuff. So I hope we could do this again. And I appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. And once again, thank you so much.